Hello everyone, and welcome back to Echoes of the Night. I know many of you use these videos to relax, unwind, or even drift off to sleep. Before you get comfortable, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from, whether it's your bedroom, a cozy living room, or maybe somewhere peaceful, like a rainy cabin in the woods. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying these stories. Tonight I have a story that begins in a place you'd think is perfectly ordinary. In fact, it seems like a place many of us would want to live, a quaint little house, tucked away on a quiet street. Our story's protagonist is Sarah, a young woman who had recently moved into an old house that had been on the market for a while. It was the perfect fit, charming, affordable, and isolated enough to enjoy some peace and quiet. Sarah had spent the entire day unpacking, arranging furniture, and setting up her cozy little space. As the sun began to set, she made herself a cup of tea and settled on the couch by the window, listening to the soft pitter-patter of the rain against the glass. It felt like the perfect end to the day. There was something comforting about the stillness. The only sounds were the occasional creak of the house settling and the whispering rain outside. Nothing to disturb the calm. But as she settled in, something caught her attention, a subtle sound, almost like a soft whisper, coming from somewhere deeper within the walls of the house. For now, though, she shrugged it off. After all, it was just an old house. Or was it? The evening stretched on, with Sarah nestled on her couch, a warm cup of tea in hand. The rain outside had intensified, drumming steadily against the window, adding to the comfort of the room. The dim light from the lamp cast long shadows, and Sarah let out a contented sigh. It was peaceful here, in this house she was beginning to call home. But as the clock ticked on, small things began to stand out, things that, at first, seemed so harmless. It started with the sound. At first, Sarah thought it was just the wind rustling through the trees, or perhaps the house settling in the night. But the noise was faint, almost too faint. A soft scratching, like something delicate scraping against wood. She paused, listening intently, her eyes flicking to the dark corners of the room. She could feel her heart rate slow down, but her mind wouldn't let go of the sound. It started with the sound. At first, Sarah thought it was just the wind rustling through the trees, or perhaps the house settling in the night. But the noise was faint, almost too faint, a soft scratching, like something delicate scraping against wood. She paused, listening intently, her eyes flicking to the dark corners of the room. She could feel her heart rate slow down, but her mind wouldn't let go of the sound. She turned her attention back to the tea, telling herself it was nothing. A gust of wind, a shift in the foundation, she reasoned. But then there was a flicker, a slight movement in her peripheral vision. She snapped her head toward the window, but all she saw was the steady curtain of rain. The street outside was barely visible in the dim light, with no one around. No one but her. Shaking off the unease, Sarah reached for the remote to turn on the television. It wasn't long before her eyes found themselves drawn back to the far corner of the room, where shadows pooled in the dim light. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. It wasn't as if she had seen something, no, that would be too obvious. But there was something off about it, something she couldn't quite place. Another creak. This time it was louder, more pronounced. She looked up quickly, staring at the hallway just beyond the living room. Nothing. The air felt heavier now, thick with silence except for the occasional drip of rain against the window. A low murmur of unease stirred in her stomach, but Sarah frowned, trying to calm herself. It was just an old house, she reminded herself. Houses creaked. Then a faint odor. It wasn't strong, but it was there. The smell of something damp, almost like mildew. She looked around, her nose scrunching in slight distaste. Her eyes scanned the walls, the corners of the room, and the floorboards, but nothing seemed out of place. She had just moved in, after all. There could be dust in the walls, something the previous owners hadn't noticed. Still, the smell lingered, more insistent now, like it was seeping in from the corners of the house. She got up, walking to the hallway with the intention of opening a window or checking the vents. As she stepped down the corridor, the floorboards creaked beneath her feet, adding to the growing tension in the house. But before she could reach the window, she stopped in her tracks. A faint, hollow sound echoed from the walls like something soft tapping from the other side. It wasn't a draft. Not this time. This sound had a rhythm to it. A deliberate tapping, as if someone or something was trying to get her attention. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sudden silence that followed made her heart pound in her chest. She strained her ears, but there was nothing. Just the beating of her own heart in her ears, and the rain continuing to beat on the glass. She stepped back, her mind racing, telling herself that it was just an old house. The pipes, the shifting foundation, the wind, anything but the alternative. But the unsettling feeling continued to creep up her spine. It's nothing. It's just my imagination, she whispered to herself, though the thought barely offered any comfort. She turned back, heading toward the living room, but as she reached the doorway, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Just as she sat back down on the couch, she heard it again, this time clearer than before, a distinct whisper from the walls, soft yet purposeful. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled, and she found herself glancing over her shoulder. Nothing. But still, the whisper seemed to linger, growing louder in her mind, even though she couldn't hear it with her ears. You're just tired, she thought, shaking her head. Just the house. It's just the house. But deep inside, she knew something wasn't right. The following days felt like an endless loop of creeping discomfort. At first, Sarah tried to convince herself that everything was fine, that the sounds she had heard, the flickering shadows, were just tricks of her mind. But the feeling of being watched, of something lingering just beyond her line of sight, never truly went away. It was as though the house had started to inhabit her thoughts, gently nudging her into a state of constant unease. It started with the way the objects moved. Small things insignificant in themselves, but the kind of things that caught the corner of her eye. A mug she had left on the counter would be placed on the other side of the kitchen when she returned. A book she had set down on the coffee table would be slightly shifted to the left. It wasn't much, but it was enough to gnaw at her mind, enough to make her glance around suspiciously when she entered a room. It wasn't like she was forgetful, but the constant shifting of things, small, almost imperceptible movements, made her wonder if someone was messing with her. One evening, Sarah came home to find her keys gone. She distinctly remembered setting them down on the kitchen counter. Yet, when she reached the counter, they weren't there. A quick search of the apartment revealed nothing. She felt a pulse of irritation mixed with a sense of unease. She was sure she hadn't moved them. After minutes of frantic searching, she spotted the keys sitting neatly on the shelf next to the door, where she never left them. That's when the shadows started. At first, they were subtle, little flickers in her peripheral vision, but soon they were harder to ignore. Sarah had started to see them more often, even when she was in broad daylight. They weren't the shadows of people or things, no. They were darker, more fluid, as though they didn't quite belong in the world of light. She would see them dart across her living room walls, vanish around corners, and at times even linger too long before fading away. Each time, her heart would race, a cold sweat prickling her skin. She tried to write it off as the shadows of branches moving in the wind, or maybe a trick of the light, but the shadows didn't act like that. They were unnerving, like they had a life of their own. She'd stare at them, willing them to stay still long enough to make sense of them, but each time, they would slip away, just out of reach. That night, as the storm raged outside, Sarah was curled up on her couch, trying to focus on a book to distract herself. The rain was harder now, the wind howling outside, yet the house felt colder than it ever had. She had the lights dimmed low, just enough to keep the creeping darkness at bay, but not too bright to feel comfortable. The fire in the corner flickered, casting long shadows that danced on the walls like living things. She was lost in the pages when it happened again. The low whisper. It was soft, a breathy sound that almost felt like it came from within the walls themselves. But this time it was different. It wasn't just a fleeting sound. The whisper grew louder, more distinct. A soft, almost pleading voice calling her name. Sarah froze, her fingers clutching the book tightly. She could feel her heartbeat in her chest, pounding like a drum. No, she thought, shaking her head. It's just the wind. The house settling. It's all in my head. But then, it happened again. This time, unmistakable. Sarah, her blood ran cold. The voice was faint, but unmistakable, like it was right next to her. It sent a chill up her spine as she turned quickly, her eyes darting around the room. But there was nothing. Nothing but the rain and the crackling fire. Her breath was shallow, her chest tight with fear. She had heard it. She wasn't imagining it. But what did it mean? Was there someone in the house? The whispering didn't feel like a human voice. There was something unnatural about it, as though it wasn't meant for the living. She stood up, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end, and walked toward the hallway. The lights flickered as she moved, and for a moment, everything went dark. The house seemed to pulse with a strange energy as she stumbled forward, her hand outstretched for the light switch. When the light came back, she felt a sense of relief until she saw it. There at the end of the hall was a shadow, a dark, formless figure. It wasn't like the others she had seen. It was solid, with shape and substance. But it wasn't right. It was too dark, too still, like a presence that didn't belong. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. Her heart pounded in her ears. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow was gone, vanished into thin air, as if it had never been there. The hallway was empty, silent. Was it real? She wondered, her mind struggling to grasp what she had seen. But deep inside, she knew. It wasn't a figment of her imagination. Something was in the house. The wind howled louder that night, its howl clawing at the windows as if it wanted in. Sarah sat on the couch, her eyes heavy from a long day. The storm outside had intensified, the rain now beating against the windows in a rhythm that almost soothed her. It was the kind of night that called for comfort, but the unease she'd been feeling for days had settled deep into her bones. She tried to push it aside, settling in with a warm cup of tea and the familiar hum of her favorite TV show playing in the background. But the peace didn't last long. The power flickered. Sarah frowned, the room plunging into darkness for a split second before the lights came back on. The hum of the TV sputtered out, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, the entire room felt unnaturally still. The kind of stillness that you could feel pressing against your chest, as if the air itself was holding its breath. She blinked into the dim light, trying to shake the chill that had crept over her. The TV flickered back to life, but the show was no longer playing. Instead, it displayed a static image, a faint buzzing noise emanating from the speakers. Sarah's fingers tightened around the mug, and she reached for the remote to change the channel, but the remote wouldn't respond. She pressed the buttons repeatedly, frustration creeping into her voice as she muttered under her breath. The buzzing from the TV grew louder, then suddenly cut off, replaced by something far worse. A whisper. At first, it was so faint that she thought it was part of her imagination, the wind sneaking in through the cracks, the storm playing tricks. But then, it came again. Sarah. The voice was soft, almost tender, but there was something about it that made her skin crawl. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a trick of the static. It was real. And it was coming from somewhere inside the room. Her heart pounded in her chest. The mug trembled in her hands as she slowly looked around the room, her eyes darting from corner to corner to corner, searching for the source. Nothing. Only shadows and the faint glow of the TV. The voice came again, clearer this time, as though it were standing just behind her. Sarah, I'm here. Her breath hitched. She couldn't explain it. She couldn't rationalize it. The voice, it was wrong. It wasn't human. And the worst part was that she had heard it. It was unmistakable. As real as the chair she was sitting in. But where was it coming from? Her mind scrambled for answers. Maybe it was the wind, she thought, trying to dismiss the panic rising in her throat. The power had flickered. Perhaps the electronics were malfunctioning. That had to be it. But deep down, she knew this wasn't the wind. This wasn't a malfunction. This was something else. Her hand hovered over the remote again, and this time the TV responded, the static image flickering back into place, only to be replaced by the deep crackling sound of the static filling the room. And then, the voice came again, louder, more distinct. "Sarah, you're not alone." The hairs on her neck stood on end. The words sent a shock of cold through her entire body. Her mind screamed at her to get up, to leave, but her legs felt like stone, rooted to the spot. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She tried to move, but it was as if an invisible weight had settled on her chest, keeping her still. She couldn't breathe. The room seemed to close in on her. And then, without warning, the door to the hallway slammed shut. The force of it made her jump, her heart leaping into her throat. She whipped her head around, her eyes wide, as the echoes of the door's violent slam reverberated through the apartment. Everything was still again. The TV hummed quietly. The rain pounded outside. But it was the silence that followed the slamming door that felt the heaviest. It was thick, oppressive, as though the air had thickened with an unseen presence. The whisper was gone. The hum of the TV had quieted to a mere murmur, and Sarah could only hear the rapid beating of her heart in her ears. Was it real? Was this happening? She rushed to the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle, but before she could grasp it, a cold gust of wind swept through the room, slamming the door harder than she had ever felt. The wind was so sharp, it felt like it was alive, like something or someone was pushing against the door from the other side. She recoiled, stepping back, her breath coming in quick gasps as the adrenaline surged through her body. What the hell was going on? She asked herself again. In that moment, she was certain. This wasn't just her imagination. And whatever it was that had been watching her wasn't going away. Sarah barely slept that night. The voice, the door slamming, it replayed in her mind over and over like a broken record, and every time she closed her eyes, she could almost hear the whisper again. The next day, she tried to push it aside. After all, it was just her imagination, right? A trick of the mind, maybe too much stress. The storm outside had been loud, the wind howling in ways she wasn't used to. But as the day went on, the sensation of being watched grew stronger. It started subtly, a shiver running down her spine when she was in the kitchen, as if someone was standing just behind her, a feeling of being watched, even though she was alone in the apartment. She tried to brush it off, telling herself it was the old creaky building settling, or perhaps the paranoia creeping in from lack of sleep. But every time she moved, the feeling followed. It was as if there was an invisible presence, trailing her every step. The noises began shortly after. At first it was faint, a soft scratching sound, like nails running along the walls. It would happen when she was sitting quietly, reading or cooking. The first few times she'd convince herself it was just the wind or the building's structure shifting. But then it came again, louder, more distinct, as if something was deliberately tapping at the walls. She froze, holding her breath, straining to listen. Nothing. It was silent, just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, lingering just out of sight. Later that evening, as she made her way to the bathroom, she passed the hallway mirror and caught a glimpse of something, just a flash of movement. It was almost like a shadow flickering, but when she turned to look, there was nothing there. Her heart skipped a beat, and she quickly hurried to the bathroom, her reflection still lingering in her mind. As she washed her hands, she felt it again. That prickling sensation at the back of her neck, as if someone was standing right behind her, breathing down her neck. She spun around, but the bathroom was empty. The only thing she could hear was the steady dripping of the faucet, echoing off the tiles. Then, a faint rustling sound, almost like someone shifting their weight, came from the other side of the room. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She slowly turned her head, eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. There was nothing. No one. Yet she couldn't shake the sense that she wasn't alone. It felt as though the air itself had thickened, as if the walls were closing in on her, pressing in from all sides. She stepped back, almost stumbling, and quickly shut the door behind her. That night she curled up under the covers, trying to convince herself that it was just the stress, that she was just imagining things. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It hung in the air like a suffocating fog, making her feel exposed and vulnerable. Every noise seemed amplified, every creak, every gust of wind, every groan of the house's foundation. And then, there it was again. A soft, almost imperceptible sound. The faintest tap. Tap, tap, from somewhere just outside her bedroom door. Her heart skipped. The sound was unmistakable now, and it wasn't from the wind. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. Tap, tap. She sat up in bed, her breath shallow, her eyes darting to the door. For a moment she just listened. The house was unnervingly still, the only sound the heavy beating of her own heart. Her hand reached for the lamp beside her, but before she could flip the switch, the door creaked open. It didn't open wide, just a few inches, enough for Sarah to catch a glimpse of the darkened hallway beyond. The lamp beside her flickered, casting a dim light over the room. The shadow in the hallway seemed to twitch, shifting unnaturally. But she couldn't see anything. No figure, no movement, just the dark expanse of the hallway stretching out before her. "Hello," she whispered, her voice trembling despite her attempt to keep it steady. She waited for an answer, but there was only silence, thick and suffocating. Then the sound came again. A tapping followed by a dragging noise, like nails scraping along the floor, slow and deliberate. It came from just outside the door. She could feel the air growing colder, the temperature dropping like a shadow was stealing the warmth from the room. Her breath caught in her throat as her eyes fixed on the crack of the open door, but she couldn't bring herself to move closer. It was as though the door was a barrier, a thin, fragile line between her and whatever was out there. Suddenly the tapping stopped. The dragging sound followed, and then nothing. The door remained cracked open, and in the silence, Sarah realized she hadn't heard a single footstep. No shifting of weight, no other sound but the soft scrape of something unseen. It was as if the presence had surrounded her, was waiting in the shadows. The temperature in the room had dropped even further, and the hairs on her arms stood up. Her pulse was hammering in her ears as she stayed still, barely breathing, waiting for something, anything. But there was nothing. No more noises, no more tapping. Only an eerie, suffocating silence that hung in the room, like something unseen was watching her from the other side of that door. And somehow, that silence felt even worse than the sounds. The days began to blur together for Sarah. The isolation crept into every corner of her life, like a dark fog slowly smothering everything. She tried to reach out to friends and family, desperate for some comfort, a lifeline. But each time she picked up the phone, something held her back, some part of her that whispered, "What if they think you're crazy? What if they could never understand?" She could almost hear the words she feared, "It's all in your head." The thought made her stomach twist with dread. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something out there, something unseen but deeply felt, and it was growing stronger every day. But how could she explain it to anyone who would believe her? Her closest friend, Lisa, had been supportive at first, asking if she needed anything, offering to come over. But as Sarah described the strange noises, the whispers, the tapping, the things moving when they shouldn't, Lisa's tone shifted. There was no outright dismissal, no obvious judgment, but Sarah could tell by the silence on the other end of the line that Lisa didn't truly believe her. "You're just stressed, Sarah. You've been through a lot lately with work and everything. Maybe you need a break. A vacation. Get some fresh air," Lisa suggested, her voice a little too cheerful. as if trying to convince both Sarah and herself. But Sarah knew better. This wasn't stress. This wasn't exhaustion. This was something else. The darkness was closing in on her, pressing against the walls of the apartment, suffocating her. Each time she tried to sleep, the nightmares grew worse, more vivid. She would dream of someone standing at the foot of her bed, watching her, and no matter how much she screamed, they never moved. They just stood there, silent, with eyes that seemed to glow with an unnatural intensity. She couldn't remember when it started, but now, it was as if the shadows in her home were alive. The dim corners of her apartment felt thick with malevolence, like something was hiding there, waiting, its presence heavy in the air. She couldn't look at the mirror without feeling the cold brush of something unseen pressing against her back. One afternoon, in a rare attempt to clear her head, she went to the local coffee shop. She needed a change of scenery, a moment of normalcy. The barista smiled at her, offering her usual order, a simple black coffee. She tried to smile back, but it felt hollow, strained. The warmth of the cup did little to shake the coldness that had settled into her bones. Sitting by the window, she tried to focus on the book she'd brought with her. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't concentrate. Her eyes kept flicking to the door, to the people who walked past. She felt eyes on her, and every time she looked up, the feeling would vanish. It was as if someone was watching her from the corner of the room, but every time she turned, there was nothing there. The worst part was the silence, the absolute, suffocating quiet that had filled the spaces in her apartment. The quiet that clung to her even in public, when the noise around her should have drowned it out. She could hear the sound of her pulse pounding in her ears, as if her body was screaming in protest, desperate for something to break the stillness. As the sun began to set and the streets filled with the usual evening bustle, Sarah stood up to leave. She wanted to go home, to lock herself inside the apartment. At least there, in the solitude, she could try to make sense of what was happening to her. But as she left the coffee shop, she felt the familiar pressure in her chest, the weight of the unseen presence pushing against her every step. The minute she entered her apartment, she knew something was different. It felt colder. The temperature had dropped, the air thick with a strange, almost metallic scent. Her breath came out in visible clouds, though the heating was on, the windows closed tight. There was no mistaking it now. The house wasn't just settling. It wasn't just the building groaning in the wind. Something was moving in the walls, behind the floors, just beyond her reach. She could hear the faintest scratching, like claws scraping against wood. And then the unmistakable sound. A soft whisper. It was coming from the hallway again. Sarah froze. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she tried to steady her breathing, to convince herself it was just the wind. The house creaked, and she could hear the rain starting to fall outside, tapping against the windows like a soft, incessant drumming. But then, the whisper came again. Clearer this time. Sarah. Her heart lurched in her chest. The voice wasn't clear, but it was unmistakable. It called her name softly, gently, like someone standing just outside her door, trying to get her attention. Her throat went dry. She backed away from the hallway, retreating into the safety of the living room. But no matter how far she moved, the voice seemed to follow. It was in the walls, the ceiling, the floorboards. It whispered from all directions, a chorus of voices that blended together, indistinguishable from one another. But all of them spoke her name. The walls groaned in response, and the whispering grew louder, more insistent. Panic surged in Sarah's chest. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. All she could do was stand there, trapped in the suffocating quiet, surrounded by whispers that promised something awful. Something she couldn't see but could feel all around her. There was no escaping it. She was alone. And whatever was here wasn't going to let her forget it. Sarah's mind was unraveling, thread by thread. Every day felt like a nightmare, each moment stretching into an eternity of dread. She couldn't escape it, couldn't escape the whispering, the presence, the eyes that never left her. No matter how many lights she turned on, how many locks she bolted, it felt like the darkness followed her, wrapping itself around her like a vice. The shadows in her apartment weren't just shadows anymore. They were something else, something far darker and far more real. She could see them moving, shifting in the corner of her eye. At night, when she tried to sleep, she could hear them soft, scraping noises like fingernails on glass. But when she looked, there was nothing there. The only proof she had was the gnawing feeling in her chest, the icy grip that tightened with each passing minute. She tried everything. The lights were on all day, but it didn't matter. The whispers followed her deep in the walls, like they were waiting for her to slip up. They spoke in a language she didn't understand, but somehow it felt like they were laughing at her. They were mocking her. The longer it went on, the more impossible it became to distinguish between reality and the horrors creeping into her mind. One night, after another sleepless evening, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She couldn't stay in that apartment. Not another minute, not with the whispers growing louder. She grabbed her phone and tried calling Lisa again. This time, her voice cracked when she spoke. "Lisa, please. You have to come. There's something here. I can't stay here alone anymore. I'm not crazy, please," she pleaded, her voice faltering with the weight of her desperation. The call went to voicemail. Her breath hitched as she ended the call. Tears welled up in her eyes and the world around her blurred. She felt like she was losing herself, losing control of everything. What if she was crazy? What if it really was just her mind playing tricks? What if everything, the whispers, the shadows, was just a figment of her imagination? But no. Deep down, she knew it wasn't. She could feel the weight of the presence all around her, pressing down like a suffocating cloud. It wasn't just in her mind. It was real. The thought brought an intense wave of panic, and she dropped to her knees. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing inward, like the house itself was alive and tightening around her. Her breath came in ragged gasps, each exhale feeling like it might be her last. She stumbled to her feet, dizzy with the overwhelming sense of being trapped. Frantically, Sarah rushed to the front door, fumbling with the locks. She needed to get out. She needed to escape. She didn't care where, anywhere but here. Anywhere that didn't feel like the air was thick with malice. Her fingers shook as she pulled at the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked, she was sure of it. She remembered locking it just moments ago. But it wasn't just the lock that was keeping her in, it was something else. The door won't open. It's not meant to open. The thought settled in her chest like lead. She pulled harder, but the door refused to yield. It felt as though someone was on the other side, pushing back against her efforts, mocking her, like it was in control. She was the one who was trapped, not the door. Her mind spun, and the edges of her vision blurred as panic set in. The walls felt like they were closing in around her. The whispers were louder now, echoing through her skull. They were all around her, their voice a chorus of mocking, unintelligible Sarah. 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 With every whisper, she felt her grip on reality slipping. She staggered backward, her eyes wild as they darted from corner to corner room, expecting anything to leap out of the shadows. The fear gripped her in a way that was unlike anything she had ever felt. It wasn't just fear of what she could see, it was the fear of what she couldn't. Was she losing her mind? The thought sank in deeply, a sharp knife twisting in her gut. What if it was all in her head? What if the shadows, the whispers, the feeling of being watched, what if it was just the manifestation of her own unraveling mind? But even as she thought this, a part of her, the logical, grounded part, knew that wasn't true. This wasn't a breakdown. This wasn't stress or paranoia. It was something real. Something was here. The feeling of being watched returned, suffocating, overwhelming. She turned, her eyes wide with panic, and she saw it. For just a fleeting moment, barely enough time for her to register it, she saw a figure, a silhouette, standing in the hallway, bathed in darkness. It was tall, too tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally in the dim light. And then it was gone. As if it had never been there. As if her mind had created it. But she knew better. She felt it in her bones, that cold, malicious presence that had been with her from the start. It wasn't her mind. It wasn't a trick. The tears came now, unbidden. Sarah's hands trembled as she sank to the floor, her body curling into itself as the darkness closed in. She was losing herself, she knew it. She was spiraling into something she couldn't escape. The house seemed to breathe around her. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Her skin crawled, the hair on her arms standing on end. Something was wrong, something was terribly wrong, and she couldn't fight it anymore. The last thought that crossed her mind before the darkness overtook her was a single, desperate wish: please, let it end. And then, everything went quiet. The silence in the apartment was deafening. Sarah's mind felt fractured, her thoughts running wild, untethered from reality. She sat on the cold floor, knees pulled tightly to her chest, trembling, her eyes darting around the room, half expecting the walls to close in on her once again. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was even worse. It was suffocating, oppressive. It felt like a prelude to something worse. And then it happened. The floorboards groaned, the unmistakable sound of something heavy shifting across the room. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, and she whipped her head around to see if anything was moving, if anything was there. She saw nothing. Only the dim, flickering light of the kitchen lamp and the shadows lurking in every corner. But then came the noise. A loud, shrieking sound like metal scraping against metal, followed by a loud crash. It came from the hallway, the same hallway where she had seen the silhouette earlier. It was louder now, closer. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, her pulse pounding in her ears. She couldn't move. Her body felt frozen in place, as if the very air around her was thick with a supernatural force that kept her from escaping. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, to get out, but she couldn't. The fear was paralyzing, chaining her to the spot as the terror built around her. The lights flickered again, plunging the apartment into darkness. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She knew she wasn't alone anymore. Whatever had been hiding in the shadows, whatever had been whispering her name, was here. She could feel its presence so strong, so overwhelming, that it made her blood run cold. And then, from the corner of her vision, she saw it. The figure, tall and grotesque, its limbs stretching unnaturally long, its face contorted into a twisted, grinning mask. Its eyes, empty and black, locked onto hers, and for a moment Sarah felt the crushing weight of its gaze as if it was pulling her into its depths. The thing didn't move. It simply stood there, watching her, its grin widening with each passing second. Sarah's chest tightened, the air growing thick and heavy, suffocating her with a presence that seemed to suck the life out of the room. She wanted to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. Then, the entity's mouth opened slowly, deliberately revealing rows of jagged, razor-sharp teeth. A bone-chilling growl reverberated through the room, like the sound of something ancient, something otherworldly. Sarah's heart raced as the thing moved closer, its limbs contorting unnaturally, cracking with each step, as though it was not bound by the same laws of nature that governed her own body. It reached out with one of its long, twisted arms, fingers clawing through the air like they were grasping for something, someone. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat as the entity's hand hovered just inches above her, its nails scraping the floor as it moved closer. She could feel the cold emanating from it, a chill that sank deep into her bones, numbing her. A sudden deafening crash filled the room. The entire apartment shook, the walls groaning under some unseen pressure. The lights burst into brilliant white flashes, only to flicker and die again, plunging the apartment back into darkness. The growl grew louder, more guttural, filling every inch of the room. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the entity lunged at her, its outstretched fingers diving toward her neck. A scream tore from Sarah's throat, raw and desperate, as she slammed her hands over her ears, trying to block out the noise, the terror. She scrambled backward, her feet slipping on the slick floor as the entity's fingers brushed against her skin, sending a shockwave of ice through her body. Her head spun, her vision blurred. She was no longer in control of her body, no longer aware of what was real. All she knew was that she had to escape, had to get away from whatever this thing was. She clawed at the walls, her nails digging into the plaster as she tried to push herself up, but her strength was failing her. The air seemed to grow thicker, heavier, as the entity closed in on her. It let out a sickening laugh, the sound low and cruel, vibrating through the walls. The laughter echoed through her skull, causing her to collapse to the floor, breathless, consumed by fear. But as she lay there, barely able to move, something inside her snapped. A surge of adrenaline coursed through her veins. She had to fight back. She had to survive. With one final, desperate cry, Sarah pushed herself to her feet, ignoring the pain in her body, the dizziness in her head. She wasn't going to let this thing take her. Not now. Not ever. With shaking hands, she grabbed the nearest object, a glass vase, and hurled it toward the entity. It shattered against the wall, the sound of the impact deafening in the silence. But it didn't stop the thing. It didn't flinch. It's not real. It can't be real. It has to stop. The thought pushed her forward. She wasn't going to let it win. The room felt alive, suffocating, but in her mind, she found the strength to move. Her eyes darted around, searching for any way out. But the only thing she could see was the figure now closer, its jagged teeth inches away from her throat. And then, with one final scream, the world went black. When Sarah awoke, she didn't know where she was. Her head throbbed, her body bruised, and her mind was clouded with a fog that made everything feel distant. Unreal. The apartment was eerily silent, not the oppressive quiet she had become accustomed to, but a hollow silence, like everything was holding its breath. She was lying on the cold floor, a few feet away from the living room couch. The room was dark, much darker than she remembered, with only the faintest slivers of light creeping through the curtains. She tried to move, but her limbs felt heavy, sluggish, as if the very act of shifting had drained the last of her energy. A sharp chill ran down her spine as she realized something was wrong. The air felt different, thick, weighted, as though the very atmosphere in the room had changed. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and her chest tightened with the feeling of an unseen weight pressing down on her. Then, she saw it. A faint, misty figure appeared at the edge of her vision, standing by the window, its shape barely distinguishable in the dim light. Her heart raced. She knew this presence, the one she had felt for weeks, the one that had tormented her in every corner of the apartment. But now it wasn't a shadow. It was real. She could see it, clear as day. The figure began to move slowly toward her, its outline becoming clearer with every step, until the horrifying truth struck her like a slap in the face. It was her. It was a version of herself, pale, disheveled, and contorted in ways that no living person could possibly be. The eyes were empty black voids staring at her with an intensity that made her insides churn. Its mouth twisted into a grin, a grotesque imitation of her own face. It was her, but it wasn't. Sarah gasped, scrambling to her feet, only to stumble back again, falling hard against the wall. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized the horror wasn't just in the apartment. It was in her, too. She had been living with this entity, this thing inside her for weeks, and now it was staring her down. The specter of herself slowly raised one hand, a finger pointing directly at her. Its mouth opened, but no words came out. Instead, a horrific noise filled the room, like a low, guttural whisper that seemed to be coming from the walls themselves. The sound clawed at her sanity, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. Her chest constricted, and the air around her thickened to the point where it felt like she was suffocating. "No," she whispered hoarsely, her mind reeling. "What are you?" The figure's grin widened further. The eerie whispering stopped, replaced by the chilling sound of her own voice, distorted and twisted. "You should have never come here." The words made her blood run cold. As the figure's mouth closed, it slowly began to fade, dissipating into a fine mist that vanished into the darkness of the room. A flash of memories shot through her mind, jumbled and fractured. She remembered moving into this apartment. How perfect it seemed at first. The quaintness of it, the soft creak of the floors, the warm, inviting feel of the living room. But she had been drawn to the apartment for a reason, one she hadn't realized until now. The curse. Her breath faltered. She had heard whispers about this place when she first moved in, rumors from neighbors. Offhand comments about a previous tenant who had disappeared without a trace. A woman who had lived alone and been a recluse. No one ever saw her leave. They said she had been consumed by something dark, something that lingered in the walls. Sarah's stomach turned. The haunting wasn't a random occurrence. It was tied to the apartment itself. The place had been cursed long before she had moved in. The entity wasn't just haunting her. It had been waiting for her. Waiting for someone to awaken it, to stir it from its dormant state. And it had chosen her. With a horrifying clarity, Sarah realized that the entity had been feeding off her fears, growing stronger with every moment she had spent in the apartment. The more she had tried to ignore the disturbances, the more it had grown in power. And now it was no longer just a presence, it was her. It had become her dark reflection, a twisted version of herself, manifesting in the very place where she had let it fester. The revelation hit her like a tidal wave, and her mind raced to process everything. She wasn't just being haunted. She was being consumed by her own worst fears, her own isolation. The curse had found its vessel in her. This apartment had become a breeding ground for her deepest anxieties, feeding off her loneliness and desperation. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, and she took a shaky step back, only to find herself stumbling into the cold, oppressive darkness again. Her eyes scanned the room in panic. She needed to get out, she needed to escape. But there was nowhere to run. The room was closing in on her. The walls, the floors, the very air she breathed, all of it was alive now. Alive with the same darkness that had consumed the apartment long before she had arrived. And the worst part was, she knew that even if she managed to escape this place, the darkness would follow her. The curse would follow her. No one would be safe. Sarah's breath came in jagged gasps, her body trembling as the reality of her situation set in. The apartment was no longer just a place she inhabited, it had become a cage, a tomb, a suffocating force that had wrapped itself around her very soul. But somehow, a fleeting thought pierced through the fog of her fear. Escape. She had to get out. The curse, the entity, whatever it was, had claimed this place. But it hadn't claimed her completely, not yet. She had seen what it was capable of, what it could become. And though her heart was heavy with dread, a part of her still fought, still wanted to survive. With trembling hands, she stumbled toward the door, the oppressive silence in the room now a constant, suffocating presence. Every step felt like wading through molasses, her limbs heavy and unwilling. But she pushed forward, driven by the single thought that if she could just escape, just make it out of the door, maybe, just maybe, she could leave all of this behind. The door, old and warped, was locked. She fumbled with the handle, her hands slick with sweat, desperation pushing her to work faster. A loud, deafening bang echoed from behind her, a sound that made her freeze. The walls creaked, the floors groaned under an unseen weight, as if the apartment itself was alive, reaching for her, pulling her back into its dark embrace. "No, no, no," she muttered, tears welling in her eyes as she pulled harder on the door. But it wouldn't budge. The entity was toying with her, trapping her in the very place she had once called home. Suddenly, a cold hand gripped her wrist. She screamed, a sound that echoed in the empty room, but no one was there. She jerked her arm away, but the grip tightened, a vice around her bones. The entity was here. Her eyes scanned the room wildly, but there was nothing, only shadows that danced menacingly in the corners. The familiar chill swept through the air, thickening it with every passing second. The low, guttural whispering returned, surrounding her, crawling into her mind like a disease. It was everywhere. But then, as if by some miracle, the door swung open with a loud creak, as though the apartment itself was releasing its grip on her. She didn't hesitate. She didn't think. She bolted out, rushing into the hallways, her heart pounding in her chest. The world outside was a blur, a confusing mess of lights and sound. She didn't stop, didn't care to look back. The apartment was behind her now, and as she ran, the weight that had been pressing on her shoulders began to lift, little by little. She was free. She was. The hand gripped her shoulder. She spun around, her heart stopping in her chest. But there was no one. Only the empty hallway stretching out in front of her. She looked around, panic rising. She was alone. She had to be. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed behind her, slow and deliberate. Her breath hitched. She couldn't stop now. She broke into a sprint, moving faster than she ever had, her legs aching, her body refusing to keep up, but she didn't care. She was almost there. She had to get out. When she reached the exit, she pushed the door open, stepping into the cold night air. It was over. She had made it. The streets were empty, the city quiet, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe again. The world was real. She had survived. But just as she began to walk away, a cold breeze brushed across her skin, sending a shiver down her spine. Her eyes widened as she turned, her heart lurching in her chest. There, in the window of the apartment she had just escaped from, she saw it. The same dark, twisted reflection of herself, staring back at her. The grin was wide and unnatural, the eyes black, hollow. And it wasn't just in the window. It was in her. Her skin crawled. The whispering, now louder than ever, began to invade her thoughts once more. You should have never left. The words cut through her like a knife, and she felt the all-too-familiar chill creeping back into her bones. She looked down at her hand. It was trembling, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she knew the truth. The curse hadn't just been confined to the apartment. It had followed her. It had always been waiting for her to slip, to doubt herself. And now, it was inside her, too. She took a step back, her heart racing as she slowly turned away from the apartment, from the eyes that would never leave her. But as she walked into the darkened night, a single thought echoed in her mind, louder than anything else. It's never over. End of story.